everyone, it's Meg and welcome back to another video. Today's video I'm going to be talking about some books that I really love or really enjoyed but I never really talk about on my channel, and I do realise that obviously there are certain books on my channel that I talk about a lot, like hence Laura Wood's books. But there's also a lot of books that I have read and really enjoyed, or just authors that I enjoy in general, but I just don't tend to talk about these books. So I could have had a much bigger list than the ones I have here. I have 8 books that I'm going to talk to you guys about today. Ironically, I have actually mentioned a couple of these in a few fairly recent videos, but the majority of them I've maybe included in a few videos in the past, but I just don't generally talk about them that much. So we're going to talk about them now and give them some love. So without further ado, let's get into the video. The first book that I have is actually a graphic novel, and that is The Tea Dragon Society by Katie O'Neill, and I read this back in July for the Reading Rush, and it is quite a popular graphic novel here on BookTube and I absolutely fell in love with it. It is, I guess it's like a children's book. It's very short and it is about these tea dragons, and there's not really much of a storyline, to be honest with you. It's about friendship and traditions and these beautiful cute little tea dragons, and I really want one. And it's just really wonderful. The art style is absolutely adorable, and there is little profiles of different sorts of tea dragons in the back, and kind of about care notes and what sort of like tea that they brew and all that sort of thing. It's just absolutely adorable and I really love it. It gets a lot of love anyway on BookTube, but it's one that I haven't talked about since I did my wrap up videos for the Reading Rush, so if you're looking for a new graphic novel, I highly recommend this one. Next up we have The 24-Hour Cafe by Libby Page, and you guys should know that I do talk about Libby quite often in my videos. I have mentioned The Lido, which is her debut, quite a few times in my videos previously, and I have mentioned this book in a couple of the videos as well, but not as much. I did really enjoy this book. I did actually read it during a reading slump, which wasn't a good idea because this was one of my most anticipated releases of the year, but I did still really enjoy it. And this is basically like a slice of life book. It's about these 2 waitresses who work in this cafe in London that's open 24 hours. The first part of the book is told from one perspective from one of the girls, and the other half of the book is told from the girl from the other perspective, and as well as some of like the customers who come into the cafe and all the other people that work there, or the people who are outside the cafe. It's just kind of a little look into everybody's lives, and as somebody who is a barista, I really like hit home with this book. I really enjoyed it. It's very much character driven and it makes you kind of look at all these entangled lives, and obviously being a creative person trying to make it in the world, because obviously our 2 main characters, Hannah and Mona, are both trying to take on full-time creative careers whilst working at this cafe, and it is just a really wonderful book. I don't love it quite as much as the Lido personally. I just connected with, well, I connect with them both. I connect this one more, but I just kind of prefer the Lido a little bit more. But I do really love this book, and if you love very much character driven stories about like being like a creative and try to make it in the world, but also like having a little dip and a little peek into other people's lives, I think you will really love this. And it made me kind of appreciate little parts of my job that I wasn't necessarily fully conscious of before, but I really enjoyed this book, and I love Libby's work in general. I will read everything that she is going to put out in the future, and I'm very excited for her next book, which is coming out next year. Next up we have a book, I don't think I've mentioned this book on my channel since I started BookTube, but that is Heartless by Marissa Meyer. And this was my very first fantasy book I ever read. Whenever this first came out, out in 2016, I believe 2016 or 2017, one or the other, that's when I first read this book. And this is the story of the Queen of Hearts and how the Queen of Hearts became Queen of Hearts. And if you don't know, I'm a very big Alice in Wonderland fan, so when I found out this book was coming out, I knew I had to read it, and I really enjoyed this book. I just feel like it's such a clever book about how Marissa Meyer has kind of taken the elements from the traditional story and the characters and put them in this setting, in this different story, and I just think it's absolutely wonderful. I think it's brilliant. I especially love the ending. I think that's very clever, and also just being able to read through this book and kind of pick up on all the things from the traditional story, like is it the lobster quadrille I think that they have in here and all that sort of thing. I just think it's so much fun and such a great look at obviously seeing how this villain from Alice in Wonderland came to be who she is, because you don't imagine that she could become this person when you first meet Kath, I think she's called at the beginning. She's called Kath or Kate. I think she's called Kath at the beginning of the book. You can tell it's been a while since I've read this, but I really love this, and if you are a Alice in Wonderland fan, I definitely recommend you pick up this book, or if you're looking for a new fantasy. I think it's really wonderful, really clever, and definitely stays true to the original story whilst also holding on its own. Next up, it's more of like a general author, this one, which is Lisa Williamson. I do have her other book up on my shelf, which is The Art of Being Normal. This is all about Mia, and I've talked about this book and Lisa's books a few times, but I honestly think that they need to be talked about more, because I don't think I've seen anybody else on BookTube that I personally watch talk about Lisa, and I think she's wonderful. She is a UK YA author, and she tackles a whole different load of topics in her books. I've only read two, which is obviously her debut, which is about a trans main character, and this is kind of a coming of age story and about sisterhood and kind of finding your way, and I just think they are such quick, easy reads. They're also very important. They cover lots of important topics and discussions, and I just think they are absolutely wonderful, and I'm always here to support UK authors as well. But I just think her work is brilliant, and if you like Holly Bourne, I think you will like her work as well, Lisa's work as well. I think she's just a great all-round author. She writes great stories. They're very easy and quick to get through, and you just get all the feels from reading her books. So if you haven't picked up Lisa's books yet, I highly recommend that you do. Next up, we have The Places I've Cried in Public by Holly Bourne, and I have actually mentioned this fairly recently in a video. I think it was my autumn book recommendations video, I think. So obviously Holly Bourne is a very popular UK YA author. She's like the queen of UK YA, and I think this is my favourite, along with The Art of Being Normal, or Am I Normal Yet, sorry. Are probably my favourite books of hers. I've read 3 books so far, and like I said, I've mentioned this maybe a few times in a couple of videos, but if you don't know what this book is about, it's basically about toxic relationships, and I think this was the first book I've ever read dealing with this topic, and I found it very eye-opening, very impactful, very hard to read, but also very important at sometimes. And I feel like I would love to read more books on this topic, and Holly always tackles very important topics and very hard topics, just like Lisa in her books, such as like mental health, toxic relationships, and all that sort of thing. And obviously I don't need to recommend Holly in general because I know a lot of people know who she is, but this is a book that I don't talk about very often. I don't talk about Holly's books too often in my videos actually, but I do really love her works. I would love to read all of her works, or nearly all of her works at any rate. And I felt this is a very important book, and if something that a lot of people should read, so I definitely recommend this, and I should talk about Holly's books more. Not that they need talking about anymore, but like I should talk about them more anyway. Next up we have Dangerous Alliance by Jennieke Cohen. I still don't know if I'm pronouncing her name right, I'm really sorry. I think I've mentioned this in a few videos in the past, I'm not entirely sure. I got this in a subscription box at the end of last year, and I read it in a few vlogs actually at the beginning of the year, and I also talked about it in a wrap-up. But this is a historical fiction novel, and it is kind of like a Jane Austen-esque inspired novel about our main character named Vicky, who lives on her family estate with her parents, and basically one day her sister, who is married, appears at the estate as her husband has been mistreating her, and there's a whole mystery aspect in this book as well, which I wasn't quite expecting. I didn't really know what to expect when I went into this book, but I really enjoyed the mystery aspects. I'm not like a super mystery book-esque person, it's not something that I generally read, but I found this really fun. And also Vicky looks up to Jane Austen, like she's read all the books that have come out by when this book is set, and she kind of tries to channel what these characters would do in the situation that she is currently in, as she has to be basically forced to marry in order to save her family's estate because of this incident that has happened with her sister. So there's a whole mystery aspect and also dealing with family. And if you get this book, I highly recommend reading the author's note, because it talks a little bit about the author's research into divorce and marriage in this time, in the 1900s. And I think it's really interesting, because obviously, like back in those days, in Georgian times and Victorian times, a woman is more of a possession to a man, like their property, like they own them, and it's not as easy as a woman to get a divorce during that time. And I just found that really interesting. Like, I'm not a massive history buff, but just kind of that whole concept and learning about it was very eye-opening and very interesting. So if you are kind of interested in learning something new about kind of history and about like the history of divorce and all that sort of thing, I definitely recommend reading this book. And also if you are into like Jane Austen or into Downton Abbey, kind of like all those period dramas, I think this is just a great book if you are a lover of all those period dramas. And it's just a great book all around. Historical fiction is something I'm definitely getting into more, and I really, really enjoyed this book, and I'm looking forward to seeing what this author comes out with in the future. Second to last book is actually a very popular book, but it's one that I don't really talk about on my channel, which is Persuasion by Jane Austen. And you should all know, like, Jane Austen is one of my favourite authors, and I don't talk about her books in my videos massively, but I feel like this is one of the ones that I talk about the least. But it's actually one of my favourite books by her. This and Emma I would probably recommend. I talk about Emma as well, but obviously that's a very popular book as well. But I really enjoyed this. It is such a wonderful story. It's her shortest novel, I think. It's just such a wonderful novel, because I originally watched the BBC adaptation of this, and I really enjoyed it. I don't know whether I preferred that. I feel like I maybe prefer it, like the adaptation and the book equally, maybe the book slightly more. But it's just such an absolutely wonderful story about like second chance romance. I love the characters, and I just think it's such a wonderful book. And I love Anne as the main character, and I love Captain Wentworth and kind of how their relationship rekindles. And yeah, I just really, really enjoyed this book, and I don't need to talk about it too much because obviously most people will know what it's about, and it's also quite a popular book, but I just really, really enjoyed this book, and I should definitely talk about it more. I'm actually going to mention one more book very quickly after this one. So this is actually the second to last book, the last physical book that I have at any rate, which is Longbourn by Jo Baker. And I really don't think I've talked about this book since I did a wrap-up video for it like last year, which was when I read it. And this is a Pride and Prejudice retelling, but from the perspective of the servants. And I've wanted to read this book for ages, and then I finally got my hands on it, and this is just such an interesting and insightful book. It does follow, obviously, the story of Pride and Prejudice, but it is also very much a story of its own, because you don't see all the events from the original story in this book, because obviously it's from the servant's perspective, but you do obviously still get the characters that are in here as well and certain elements of the book. But it's really a story about the servants that are in here, such as Sarah, and I cannot remember Mrs. Hill, that's it, about Mrs. Hill. And obviously there's a new boy that comes, I think he's called Tom, but I'm not sure. It's very much a story about the servants and their lives and their hopes and aspirations outside of caring for the Bennet family and their estate. And it's just so eye-opening to see how servants lived and worked and the conditions that they had to live in at that time. Like, it's not very nice, like hearing about kind of how hard it is on their body, but also on their mindset. And like I said before, about how they actually have bigger dreams and aspirations than working where they are now. So if you are a Jane Austen fan, if you are a Pride and Prejudice fan, I 100% recommend picking up this book. It's so intriguing, it's absolutely wonderful, it's one of my favourite retellings that I have read to date, and I really think, even if you aren't a Pride and Prejudice fan, I think you would really enjoy it, but I do recommend reading Pride and Prejudice before reading this, because then you kind of get a grip of the characters and the basic storyline, and I feel like it would also really enhance the experience. The last book that I'm actually going to mention is an audiobook that I just thought of last minute, and that is The Pirate Queen by Tricia Levenseller, and I've listened to this on audiobook and I highly recommend the audiobook. If you want to listen to this book, it is absolutely brilliant. It's actually duology. I prefer the first book to the second book personally, but this is a fantasy. I guess it's fantasy if it's about pirates, but I don't know. It's a duology about a girl named Elosa who is half siren and half human, and the first book basically follows Elosa and her crew on the ship, as she's the captain of the ship, and she's on a mission to get something back from an enemy pirate ship. So she gets herself and her crew captured purposefully to try and retrieve this item, and this is such a fun book, and it's also super angsty, and I love Elosa as the main character. I think all the characters are great. I think it is just, like I said, it's just so much fun. I couldn't stop listening to the audiobook. I listened to it so quickly. I think the narrator is amazing, and I kind of love all the sound effects like at the start and stuff, and I just think it's just a fun book. The characters are so well rounded, and I don't think I've talked about it since a wrap up that I did as well, which was at the beginning of the year. But if you're looking for like a new fantasy, or I guess it's kind of low fantasy, I don't know, I'm not an expert on this, but if you are looking for a super fun, action-packed, like angsty duology, I highly recommend this. It's just so much fun, and I haven't heard too many people talk about it actually, but it's really, really fun, and I definitely recommend that you should pick it up. So that is it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. It's really nice to talk about some books that I don't talk about generally very often on this channel, because obviously, like I said, there's certain books that I love and I will always talk about them a lot, but there's also some books that I don't talk about a lot but I do really enjoy, and for some reason I don't talk about them. So I will possibly do a part 2 of this in the future if you guys enjoyed it, and maybe you have found a book from this list that you haven't heard about that you may like to pick up, and let me know some books that you really love in the comments down below, or if you have read any of these books and your opinions on them, because I would love to know as always. If you like this video, then please make sure to give it a thumbs up, and if you would like to see more bookish videos from me, then make sure you hit the subscribe button and the bell icon so you'll be noted every time I post a new video. As always, I will leave the links to my social media along with the links to my Goodreads in the description down below for you guys. But thank you guys so much for watching. I appreciate you so much, and I will see you again very soon. Bye!